Science has shaped our world, bringing us cures for diseases, space travel, and technological marvels. But what happens when curiosity crosses a line? Throughout history, some experiments weren't just unethical, they were monstrous. From mind control projects to horrific human trials, these are the top 10 worst science experiments in history. And trust me, by the time we get to number 1, you might lose faith in humanity. Number 10, the monster study. What if a scientist told you that your biggest flaw wasn't just in your head, but a permanent, undeniable part of you? That's exactly what happened in 1939, when psychologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor conducted an experiment at the University of Iowa that would later be known as the monster study. Johnson wanted to understand how stuttering developed. His theory? That it wasn't biological, but a result of negative reinforcement. So he took 22 orphans from an Iowa children's home and split them into 2 groups. One group was praised for their speech, the other torn apart. Tudor and her team ridiculed these children, telling them they had horrible speech problems even when they didn't. Some children, who spoke perfectly fine, became so anxious they stopped talking altogether. Others developed real speech impediments, ones they never had before. Decades later, some of the subjects revealed they suffered lifelong confidence issues from the experiment. The study never should have happened, and yet no one was ever held accountable. Number 9, the Stanford Prison Experiment. What if you gave ordinary people complete control over others? How fast would they turn cruel? That's exactly what Philip Zimbardo wanted to find out in 1971. At Stanford University, he turned a basement into a prison, randomly assigning students to play either guards or prisoners. At first, things were awkward. The guards weren't sure how far they could go, but after just one day, they started punishing prisoners for minor infractions, making them do push-ups, humiliating them. By day 2, the guards were forcing prisoners to strip naked, making them clean toilets with their bare hands, beating them with no consequences. One student had a breakdown, sobbing uncontrollably. Instead of stopping the experiment, Zimbardo told the guards to push harder. The violence escalated so quickly that they had to shut the experiment down after just 6 days, even though it was supposed to last 2 weeks. Later, Zimbardo admitted he let things go too far, but defended it as a lesson on human nature. Number 8. Unit 731. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 wasn't just a research facility, it was a horror show. Founded by General Shiro Ishii, this top-secret program performed some of the worst war crimes in human history. Their goal? Biological warfare. Their test subjects? Human beings. They deliberately infected prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, then cut them open, without anesthesia, just to see how the disease spread. Some were frozen solid so they could study frostbite, slowly amputating limbs to see how long it took for the body to rot. Others were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out of their skulls. It was torture disguised as science. After Japan lost the war, you'd think these scientists would have faced justice. Nope. The US secretly granted them immunity in exchange for their research on biological weapons. The worst war criminals walked free. Number 7. The Milgram Experiment. Would you electrocute a stranger if someone in authority told you to? In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to test how far ordinary people would go if pressured by an authority figure. The setup? Participants sat in a room with an experimenter. In another room, a learner was strapped to a chair with electrodes. Every time the learner answered incorrectly, the participant had to press a button, delivering what they believed were increasingly painful shocks. At 300 volts, the learner pounded on the walls. At 350 volts, they went silent. But the experimenter, dressed in a lab coat, simply said, "The experiment requires you to continue." And most people did. A shocking 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, believing they had just killed a man. Milgram's study proved one terrifying fact: most people will do horrible things, if they're ordered to. Number 6. The Elephant LSD Experiment. What happens when scientists go too far? In 1962, researchers at the University of Oklahoma wanted to see if LSD could induce temporary madness in elephants. Their method? Injecting Tusco, a 3,000-pound elephant, with 297 milligrams of LSD. That's over 100 times what a human would take. Within minutes, Tusco collapsed, convulsed violently, and died. The scientists later admitted their calculation was way off, but Tusco was already dead. The lesson: just because we can experiment doesn't mean we should. Number 5. Project MK Ultra. Imagine waking up with no memory of the last 6 months. That's what happened to hundreds of unknowing victims of MK Ultra, a CIA mind control experiment that lasted over 2 decades. Victims were drugged with LSD for months at a time. Some were subjected to electroshock therapy so intense they forgot who they were. Others were kept in sensory deprivation chambers for weeks. When the program was exposed, the CIA destroyed most of the evidence. But one fact remained: your own government tried to control minds. Number 4. The Soviet Human Z experiment. A superhuman army, strong as gorillas, obedient as soldiers, and completely loyal to the Soviet Union. Sound like a bad sci-fi plot? Well, in the 1920s, Soviet scientist Ilya Ivanov tried to make it a reality. Ivanov specialized in artificial insemination and convinced Soviet leaders that he could breed a human-ape hybrid, a human Z, that would become the ultimate worker, soldier, or even a new species of mankind. The plan? First, inseminate female chimps with human sperm to see if they'd conceive. Then, if that didn't work, try impregnating human women with chimp sperm. At first, he set up his experiments in French Guinea, working with chimpanzees. But when none of them got pregnant, he moved to Soviet territory. Here's where it gets even darker. Ivanov planned to find Soviet women willing to carry half-ape babies. It sounds insane, but he actually had support from Soviet leaders. They believed a new hybrid species could be the perfect communist worker: strong, obedient, emotionless. Number 3. The syphilis experiments. What if your own government secretly let you die just to see what happens? That's exactly what happened in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, one of the most horrifying betrayals in medical history. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service lied to hundreds of black men in Alabama. They told them they were getting free health care. In reality, they were being studied like lab rats. These men had syphilis, a disease that can cause blindness, insanity, and death. But instead of treating them, doctors let the disease run its course. Even after penicillin was discovered as a cure, they deliberately withheld it. Hundreds of men died slow, painful deaths, while doctors took notes. When the study was finally exposed in 1972, the US government called it a mistake. A mistake? It lasted 40 years. Even today, this experiment is why so many people distrust medical institutions. Number 2. The Nazi twin experiments. Imagine being ripped away from your family, not just because of who you were, but because you had a twin. That's exactly what happened during World War II in Auschwitz. Known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele performed some of the most twisted experiments in history, specifically on twins. Why? He believed twins held the key to genetic engineering. He wanted to create the perfect Aryan race. Twins were subjected to horrifying procedures. One twin was injected with diseases to see if the other would get sick. Some had their eyes chemically altered to try and turn them blue. If one twin died, Mengele killed the other, then compared their bodies. When Auschwitz was liberated, Mengele escaped justice, hiding in South America until his death. To this day, his horrors haunt history. Number 1. The radiation experiments. What if you were dying of cancer, and instead of saving you, doctors used you for radiation testing, without your knowledge? Between the 1940s and 1970s, US government conducted horrifying human experiments, all in the name of nuclear science. Hospital patients were injected with plutonium without being told. Pregnant women were fed radioactive iron to see how it affected their unborn babies. Prisoners were forced to stand in front of nuclear blasts to see how much radiation the human body could take. These tests weren't just accidents, they were deliberate. One case involved 18 hospital patients secretly injected with plutonium. One man, Eb Cade, was never even sick. He had a broken leg. Instead of treating him, doctors pumped him full of radiation and never told him. He died in agony years later. It wasn't until the 1990s that these experiments were fully exposed, and by then, most of the victims were already dead. It's terrifying to think that our own governments have treated human lives as disposable, and it makes you wonder what experiments are happening today that we won't know about until it's too late. Science has the power to save lives, but as we've seen, it can also destroy them. Which experiment shocked you the most? Comment below. And if you want more shocking history, hit subscribe.